Hey, so I was thinking about a conversation and a comment that I had earlier with someone, and we were talking about obedience, right? And I told him that we are to be obedient to the voice of God. There are some laws that we follow, not all, depending on what God's original plan for it was. And I do have a video on that to help understand better. And I brought up Thessalonians, wrath and vengeance for those who do not obey the gospel of Christ. And he goes, yeah, the gospel of Christ, as if it was different outside of the law. Well, we have to remember that John tells us Jesus was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So Jesus was God. And by him all things were made. Okay, so Jesus created everything, right? Because he is God. And we see that in another verse that Jesus is the exact imprint of his Father's nature. So whatever God's character is, Jesus is the exact imprint of his Father's nature. So the whole Bible testifies of Jesus. The whole Bible is the gospel of Jesus, because the whole Bible testifies to God's character, to God's likeness, to who he is, what he wants, what he desires. And that is Jesus as well. That is Jesus. So yes, we have prophecies throughout the Old Testament that point towards Jesus being born and coming as human flesh to fulfill what we could not, and to do what we could not to save us, because we cannot obey him perfectly. We do need grace and mercy, but our hearts should point towards obeying him. We should not have rebellious and disobedient hearts, or we're not going to see heaven. But just think of that, you guys. The whole Old Testament points towards God's character, okay? And it shows us who God is. Just think about it. It points towards his love, his judgment, his wrath. Who he is. And so when we think about God's character throughout the entire Bible, we're also thinking about Jesus' character, because he's the exact imprint. So there are workings in the Old Testament that Jesus points to and does in the New Testament, okay? So Jesus says, I am the resurrection, right, and the life. And yes, Jesus resurrected many. He resurrected, right? When he resurrected, 500 other people resurrected with him out of their tombs. He is the resurrection. But it wasn't only in the New Testament that there's resurrections. God's power, God's anointing, Jesus' power, Jesus' anointing was on Elisha so strong that when his bones were thrown into the grave, the man who he fell on top of resurrected from the dead. So don't try to separate the Old and the New Testament that much. Like, they are not separate. They pair together perfectly. Jesus is the God of the Old Testament as well as the New Testament. The whole Bible testifies of him. The whole Bible is the gospel of Jesus Christ. Even when Paul spoke, he spoke of the gospel of Jesus Christ, right? It was his calling to teach this. And he still spoke from old scrolls and from years prior of what happened to the Israelites. Because it all points back to Jesus. All of it. And one last thing. We have to remember, Jesus came to fulfill the law, not abolish it. Okay? Fulfill does not mean he got rid of it. Abolish would mean he got rid of it. Okay? He came to fulfill it. He completed it in a way that we could not, because we are imperfect beings. But he completed it so that even when we mess up and screw up, we have grace and mercy, because he's already done it perfectly for us. It doesn't mean that we don't do anything in it. We still obey our parents, as said in Deuteronomy and now in Ephesians also. Okay? Obeying and honoring our parents was an Old Testament law that people are trying to get rid of, but it's in Ephesians as well. Okay? So there are still laws that we hold on to from the beginning of time because it lines up with God's character. You have to know God's character. Once again, Jesus did not get rid of the law, okay? He came to fulfill it so that when we messed up, we could have grace and mercy, and we didn't have to do it perfectly.